The Korean Mafia boss was already standing when it happened. His baby had been crying for so long that time no longer made sense. Minutes blending into something heavier, more humiliating. The kind of crying that didn't sound like hunger or discomfort, but panic. Thin, desperate, wrong. Like this video, subscribe, and drop a comment below where you're watching and what time it is there. Flight attendants had tried everything. One rocked the baby gently. Another warmed a bottle. Another apologized for the noise, for the delay, for nothing working. Nothing worked. People were staring now, not openly, just enough. A glance, a sigh, someone turning around in their seat, someone whispering. The boss didn't care about any of that. What terrified him was the way his baby's body felt in his arms. Tight, trembling, breath uneven. This wasn't a tantrum. This was distress. Then a woman stepped forward. She wasn't seated near him. She didn't belong in first class. She wore simple clothes, held herself carefully, like someone used to taking up as little space as possible. A single mother. She didn't raise her voice, didn't argue with the flight attendants. She didn't even look at the boss at first. She looked at the baby. "May I?" she asked quietly. Before he could answer, before the guards could move, she reached out and placed one hand gently on the baby's back. Just one touch. The crying stopped. Not slowly, not gradually, instantly. The sound vanished like it had been switched off. The baby's body relaxed. His breath evened out. His tiny fingers loosened their grip on the boss's sleeve. Silence fell across the cabin. People froze. Flight attendants stared. The guards didn't know whether to step forward or step back. The Korean Mafia boss stood there, unmoving, staring down at his child like he was seeing him for the first time. Everyone on the plane had tried. Professionals, experience, training. None of it worked. One woman did what no one else could. With a single touch. The boss finally looked up at her. "How?" he asked. She didn't smile, didn't look proud, just tired. "He's not crying because he's hungry," she said softly. "He's crying because he's overwhelmed." The baby shifted in his arms, peaceful now, asleep. The boss felt something crack in his chest, sharp, unexpected, because for the first time since his wife died, his child was quiet, and for the first time in a long time, he didn't feel in control. He felt grateful, and that scared him more than anything else. The silence didn't feel normal. It pressed down on the cabin, thick and uneasy, as if everyone was waiting for the baby to start crying again. No one moved. Even the engines felt louder now that the sound was gone. A senior flight attendant was the first to recover. "That's impressive," she said carefully, glancing between the baby and the woman. "We tried everything." The single mother nodded, already stepping back as if she hadn't meant to draw attention at all. She returned to her seat, without waiting for thanks. The Korean Mafia boss didn't sit down. He looked around the cabin, at the faces that had watched his child cry, at the people who had offered advice, suggestions, complaints. All of them had meant well. None of them had helped. His baby stirred slightly, then settled again. Alive, calm, safe. The boss tightened his hold, just enough to feel the weight of him. Doctors had promised him everything would be fine before boarding. The baby had been cleared. Normal infant distress, they'd said. He had believed them because he wanted to. Because believing experts was easier than admitting he didn't know what he was doing. But standing there now, surrounded by luxury and attention, he understood something uncomfortable. Money hadn't soothed his child. Authority hadn't helped. Control hadn't meant protection. The guards shifted, unsure whether to resume their positions. One of them leaned in slightly. "Sir, should we ask?" "No," the boss said quietly. He finally sat down. The flight attendant hovered nearby, unsure whether she was dismissed. "What did she do?" the boss asked. The attendant shook her head. She didn't follow any procedure. She just knew. The word bothered him. Knew. The baby sighed in his sleep, a small ordinary sound that felt like a victory. The boss leaned back in his seat, eyes fixed ahead, replaying the moment in his mind. The confidence of her touch, the calm in her voice, the way she hadn't hesitated when everyone else had. He realized then that this wasn't luck. This was experience. And experience was something no amount of power could buy. Across the aisle, the single mother watched him briefly, then looked away, pulling her own sleeping child closer to her chest. She hadn't done anything extraordinary. She had simply recognized pain when she heard it. The Korean Mafia boss closed his eyes for a moment, the weight of exhaustion finally settling in. For the first time since boarding the plane, he allowed himself to breathe. But a question remained, one that refused to leave him alone. Why had his baby been crying like that in the first place? And why had only one woman understood it? The Korean Mafia boss didn't take his eyes off her for the rest of the cabin service. She sat a few rows back, not in first class, her seat cramped, her child curled against her chest in sleep. She didn't look relieved. She didn't look proud. If anything, she looked like someone who had already returned to her own problems. That unsettled him. People who helped usually waited for acknowledgement, gratitude, recognition. She didn't. She adjusted her child's blanket, stared out the window, and disappeared back into the background like she'd never been there at all. The boss had built his life around noticing details others missed. Weaknesses, patterns, threats, and yet everyone on the plane, including him, had overlooked her. Until she stood up. He replayed the moment again. The way she looked only at the baby, not at him. The confidence in her hand, the absence of hesitation. That kind of certainty didn't come from training. It came from fear learned the hard way. A flight attendant leaned toward her seat with a drink refill. "Thank you," the woman said softly, then added almost as an afterthought. "Could you keep the aisle clear for a moment? I don't want to wake him." Her child stirred, then settled again. The boss noticed the way she supported the baby's head, the way her body curved protectively around him. It wasn't dramatic. It was instinct. He had never held his own son like that. That realization hit harder than he expected. The guard beside him shifted. "Sir, do you want us to ask her to move forward?" "No," the boss said, "not yet." He watched as turbulence rattled the cabin lightly. A few passengers tensed. The baby in his arms didn't stir. Safe. Across the aisle, the woman finally looked up and met his gaze. Not defiant, not curious, understanding, as if she knew exactly what he was thinking and didn't judge him for it. She gave a small nod, not permission, not reassurance, acknowledgement. Then she looked away again. The Korean Mafia boss felt something unfamiliar tighten in his chest. Respect, but it came with a dangerous question. What kind of life had taught her to recognize pain so quickly, and why did his own child need that knowledge more than money, protection, or power? He glanced down at his sleeping son, fingers brushing the soft fabric of the baby's sleeve. For the first time since his wife died, he wondered if he had been listening to the wrong voices all along. The relief didn't last. It never did. The baby shifted in his arms, a small, restless movement at first. The Korean Mafia boss felt it immediately. The change in weight, the tension creeping back into the tiny body pressed against his chest. Then the cry came again, sharp, sudden, louder than before. Heads turned all at once. The boss stiffened. His grip tightened without him realizing it, his pulse rising as the sound filled the cabin again. The peace from moments earlier vanished, replaced by the same helpless pressure squeezing his chest. Flight attendants reacted quickly this time, almost too quickly. One reached for the bottle again, another offered a blanket. Someone suggested walking the aisle. Nothing worked. The baby cried harder, his face scrunched in visible distress, his breathing uneven. It felt worse now, because the silence had given the boss hope. And hope, he was learning, was dangerous. He glanced back instinctively. The woman was already standing. She didn't rush, didn't panic. She moved with the calm of someone who had been here before, not on a plane, but in moments like this. Moments when a child's cry meant something was wrong and time mattered. A guard stepped into the aisle, blocking her path. "It's fine," the boss said before the man could speak. The woman stopped a few steps away, keeping her voice low. "He's not settled," she said. That touch helped him relax, but it didn't solve the problem. The boss looked down at his son, then back at her. "What problem?" She hesitated, not because she was unsure, but because she understood the weight of what she was about to suggest. "He needs more than being held," she said carefully. "He needs to feel safe enough to feed." The words landed heavily. Around them, the cabin felt smaller, quieter. Every sound sharpened by tension. "You're saying he's hungry," the boss said. "Yes," she replied, "but not for the bottle." The implication hung in the air, unspoken, but unmistakable. The baby cried harder, his small body arching slightly in discomfort. The boss swallowed. He had faced threats without blinking, negotiated deals that ended lives, controlled ruse with a single look. None of that helped him now. He looked at the woman again, really looked at her. Just certainty shaped by experience. "What are you suggesting?" he asked. She met his eyes steadily. I can help him feed, she said, if you allow it. The cry cut through the cabin again, louder than before. The Korean Mafia boss realized something then, as the sound echoed in his ears. This wasn't about pride. It wasn't about appearances. It was about whether he was willing to put his child's comfort above everything else. And for the first time, the decision felt heavier than any he had ever made. The Korean Mafia boss didn't answer right away. The baby's crying filled the space between them, raw and relentless, cutting through every thought in his head. He felt the stares again, some curious, some impatient, some quietly judgmental, but none of that mattered. What mattered was the sound in his arms. He had heard that cry before, in hospital corridors, in empty rooms late at night, in the silence after his wife never came back. The woman stood there, waiting. She didn't step closer. She didn't repeat herself. She understood that this was not a small thing she was asking. A guard leaned in, voice low. Sir. The boss lifted one finger. Enough. He looked down at his son's face, red, strained, desperate, and something inside him finally gave way. Not his pride, his fear. Fear of failing this child the way he had failed to save his wife. Fear of choosing the wrong thing again. He met the woman's eyes. If you're wrong, he said quietly, he will suffer. She nodded. I know. If you're right, he continued, everyone will see. I know that too, she replied. The baby cried louder, his tiny fists clenching. That decided it. The Korean Mafia boss stepped aside. The cabin seemed to inhale all at once. He handed his baby to her carefully, awkwardly, like someone passing over something precious and fragile without knowing the rules. For a moment, his hands lingered, reluctant to let go. She took the baby with practiced ease, turned slightly, adjusted her posture, shielded him from the noise and the lights without making a show of it. Then she did what no one on the plane expected. She breastfed him. There was no announcement, no explanation, just a quiet, instinctive act, done with dignity and focus. The effect was immediate. The baby latched on. The crying stopped. Not slowly, not in stages, stopped. The sound disappeared so completely that the quiet felt unreal. The baby's body relaxed against her, his breathing evening out, his hands unclenching one finger at a time. Someone exhaled loudly behind them. Another passenger looked away, suddenly embarrassed to have been watching. The Korean Mafia boss stood frozen. He had ordered men's lives ended with less hesitation than it had taken him to make this choice. And yet this simple act, had done what his power, his money, and his preparation could not. The woman looked up briefly. He was starving, she said softly. Just not for formula. The boss swallowed hard. For the first time on the flight, he didn't feel exposed. He felt humbled. And as his son fed peacefully in a stranger's arms, one truth settled heavily in his chest. Some needs cannot be outsourced. Some comfort cannot be bought. And sometimes, the bravest thing a man can do is step aside and let someone else save his child. Watching his son feed so calmly broke something open in him. The Korean Mafia boss didn't move. He couldn't. The image in front of him, his child finally at peace, dragged him back to a place he avoided at all costs. The hospital. The smell of antiseptic. The steady beeping of machines. His wife's hand in his, warm and trusting. They had told him it was a simple operation. Routine. Safe. He remembered nodding, signing papers, stepping aside like he always did. Confident that money, influence, and preparation guaranteed outcomes. He had never been so wrong. She never woke up. One moment he was pacing the corridor, rehearsing calls and schedules. The next, a doctor stood in front of him, face tight, voice careful, explaining how things sometimes went wrong. Sometimes. He remembered the weight of their newborn in his arms as the words washed over him. Remembered the way the baby cried, sharp and confused, while the world around him went unbearably quiet. From that day on, everything changed. The house became silent. The room stayed dark. The baby cried often. He hired nurses, specialists, consultants, people with perfect credentials and calm voices. They told him what to do, when to feed, how to hold, how long to wait. But none of them were her. At night, when the crying returned, he stood alone in rooms too big for two people who were gone. He held his son awkwardly, afraid of doing the wrong thing, afraid of failing again. He told himself the crying was normal. He told himself the experts knew best. He told himself he was doing enough. But standing there on the plane, watching a stranger do in seconds what he hadn't managed in months, the truth pressed in hard and unforgiving. His son hadn't just been crying for food. He had been crying for something the boss no longer knew how to give: comfort, warmth, the presence of a mother who understood him, without needing instructions. The Korean Mafia boss lowered his gaze, jaw tight, emotions he had buried for months, threatening to surface in front of strangers. He had lost his wife on an operating table, and ever since, he had been losing his son, one unanswered cry at a time. The Korean Mafia boss hadn't planned to fly himself. Normally, the child would have been sent ahead with nurses, guards, and instructions written in careful detail. Normally, he would have stayed behind, managing things from a distance like he always did. But this time was different. After months of sleepless nights and unanswered crying, he had reached a limit he didn't know how to admit out loud. He didn't know how to do this alone. That was why he was on the plane. He was taking his son to see his mother-in-law, the woman who had raised his wife, the woman who had known how to quiet her with nothing but a look and a touch. She had offered gently, without accusation, to take the baby for a while. "Let me help," she had said over the phone. "You're trying to be everything by yourself." He hadn't answered right away. Pride told him to refuse. Fear told him to agree. In the end, fear won. He told himself it was temporary, that it was practical, that the baby needed consistency and experience, not a grieving father who froze every time the crying started. So he boarded the flight with one goal: get his son safely to someone who knew what he was doing. But somewhere between the runway and the sky, the plan began to unravel. The baby cried harder than he ever had before. Not the soft crying of discomfort, not the brief protests he had learned to tolerate. This was relentless, desperate, the kind of crying that made the boss's chest tighten until it hurt to breathe. Every sound felt like an accusation. "You don't know how to do this. You're failing him." That was why the moment on the plane shook him so deeply, because in front of strangers, at 30,000 feet, he had been forced to confront the truth he had been running from. It wasn't that his mother-in-law was better. It was that his son needed something he hadn't learned how to give yet. And for the first time, the Korean Mafia boss understood that this journey wasn't just about handing his child over. No one spoke. The baby fed quietly in the woman's arms, his earlier cries now nothing more than a memory hanging in the air. The engines hummed steadily, the seatbelt sign glowed, and yet the entire cabin felt suspended, like time itself had slowed to witness something it didn't fully understand. Passengers looked away out of instinct, suddenly aware they had been watching something private. A few stared at the seatbacks in front of them, as if embarrassed by their own relief. The flight attendants stopped hovering. There was nothing left to do. The Korean Mafia boss remained standing for a long moment, unsure where to place himself. He had never been good at moments that didn't require decisions, orders, or control. This one asked him to simply wait, and waiting was unbearable. The woman adjusted the baby slightly, shielding him with her body. Her movements were unhurried, practiced, deeply familiar. She wasn't performing kindness. She was responding to need. The baby sighed in his sleep, a small sound that landed hard in the boss's chest. He sat down slowly. Across from him, his reflection in the darkened window looked older than it had hours earlier. Not weaker, just changed. "How long?" he asked quietly. The woman glanced up, careful not to disturb the child. "Since takeoff," she said. "He'd been trying to tell you." The words weren't sharp. They weren't accusing. That somehow made them harder to hear. "I tried," he said, almost to himself. "I know," she replied. That stopped him. She met his eyes then, her expression steady, unafraid. "You didn't ignore him. You just didn't know what he needed yet." The boss looked down at his sleeping son. The tension he had carried since boarding, the tightness in his shoulders, the constant readiness, began to loosen, inch by inch. Around them, the cabin returned to life. A cart rolled softly down the aisle. Someone coughed. The flight attendant resumed service. But something had shifted. This was no longer a crisis being managed. It was a moment being remembered. The woman glanced toward her own seat, where her child slept peacefully. "He'll be fine now," she said gently. "At least for a while." The Korean Mafia boss nodded. For the first time on the flight, he wasn't thinking about getting to his destination. He was thinking about what would happen after he landed. The Korean Mafia boss waited until the baby was fully asleep before speaking again. The woman held him carefully, her movements slow, deliberate, as if she understood how fragile the piece was. When she finally lifted her eyes, she didn't look surprised that he was still watching. He cleared his throat once. "How did you know?" he asked. It wasn't a challenge. It wasn't suspicion. It was something closer to defeat. She looked down at the baby before answering, her voice low enough that only he could hear. "When you're alone with a child," she said, "you stop listening to advice and start listening to fear. Not your own. Theirs." The words stayed with him. He thought of all the people who had advised him since his wife died. Doctors, nurses, specialists, people who spoke with certainty and charts and rules. None of them had ever mentioned fear. He shifted in his seat. "Everyone tried," he said. "Professionals, trained people." She nodded. "They tried to fix him." She looked up at him then. "I tried to understand him." The difference hit him harder than he expected. "My wife," he said quietly, surprising himself by saying it out loud, "used to calm him like this." The woman didn't interrupt. "She died during surgery," he continued. "He was barely born." "I'm sorry," she said, simply. No rehearsed sympathy, no awkward pause, just truth. "He cries most at night," he admitted. I thought he just didn't like being held by me." She considered that. "Babies don't reject," she said gently. "They react. They learn. If they cry, it's because something inside them is asking for help." The boss looked at his son again, peaceful and warm, unaware of the weight of the conversation happening around him. "I don't know how to replace her," he said. "You don't have to," she replied. "You just have to stay." He felt something tighten behind his eyes and forced it back down. "What about you?" he asked. "How did you learn all this?" She smiled faintly, not proudly, not sadly. "I learned because I didn't have anyone else," she said. "When my son was born, it was just us. I made mistakes. I panicked. I listened when he cried because no one else was going to." She adjusted the baby once more, preparing to hand him back. The Korean Mafia boss hesitated before taking his son. Not because he was afraid, but because for the first time, he understood what the cry had been asking for all along. The plane touched down gently. Applause broke out somewhere near the back, brief and automatic. But the Korean Mafia boss barely noticed. His attention was fixed on the small weight in his arms, his son, sleeping deeply, his breathing slow and steady. He hadn't cried again. The woman stood, lifting her bag onto her shoulder and waking her own child carefully. She moved with the ease of someone used to traveling alone, used to leaving places without ceremony. Before she could step into the aisle, the boss spoke. "Thank you." It wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. It was honest. She nodded once. "He's a good baby," she said. "He just needed to feel heard." Guards closed in instinctively, ready to guide him forward, but he raised a hand. "Not yet. My mother-in-law is waiting for him," he said. "She'll take care of him for a while." The woman studied his face. "And you?" He hesitated. "I'm learning," he said finally. That seemed to satisfy her. They reached the door of the aircraft together. Passengers filed past, some glancing at the baby with quiet curiosity, others pretending not to look at all. Before they parted, she spoke once more. "Don't be afraid when he cries again," she said. "It doesn't mean you're failing. It means he trusts you enough to ask." The boss nodded, committing the words to memory. As she disappeared into the crowd, he felt no urge to follow, to question, to offer anything in return. Some debts weren't meant to be paid. Outside the terminal, the world returned to its usual noise, cars, voices, movement, but inside him something had settled. He held his son closer, not to protect him from the world, but to stay present in it. For the first time since his wife died, the Korean Mafia boss didn't feel like he was passing his child away.